September 1931, 25 miles off the Norfolk coast, a British fishing skipper named Pilgrim Lockwood is hauling his net up from the dark. Inside the catch is one black block of peat, useless. He picks up his shovel to break it apart and throw it overboard. His shovel hits something hard. It sounds like striking metal. He breaks the peat open with his bare hands. Inside is an object, 8.5 inches long, carved from antler, barbed along one edge. A harpoon, made by a human being who had been dead for 9,000 years. The man who carved it never lived on a British island. He never saw the North Sea. He lived on a continent. Pilgrim Lockwood had just pulled up the first piece of a lost world. He did not know it. Nobody in 1931 knew it. It would take another 60 years before anyone gave that drowned continent a name. This is the forensic story of Doggerland, the lost continent of Stone Age Europe, the wave that killed it, and the bones, the weapons, and the art that are still coming up out of the sea. 3 things you need to know before we step into that black water. 1. The continent under the North Sea was bigger than Switzerland. 2. Britain was once connected to mainland Europe. 3. A single wave killed it, but not in a day. It took 1,000 years. 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age was ending. The world was warming. Glaciers were melting back, and rising sea levels were eating the lowlands of Europe. But the seas had not yet flooded the bridge between Britain and the continent. What we now call the North Sea was dry land, a continent. 18,000 square miles of forest, river valleys, and marshland, bigger than Switzerland. Today we call it Doggerland, though for the people who lived on it, it was simply home. They hunted aurochs, giant wild cattle. They fished. They gathered hazelnuts. They carved art. They buried their dead. They were not primitive. They were a civilization, but their world was already dying. Every generation noticed the shoreline moving. Coastal villages their grandparents had hunted in were now underwater. Islands that used to be hills. Sea creeping inland, inch by inch, generation by generation. By 8,200 years ago, what remained of Doggerland was a single main island, about 1,000 square kilometers, the last high ground. And then the real killer came. The real killer was not the slow-rising sea. The real killer was buried under the Norwegian Sea. For thousands of years, glaciers had piled unstable sediment onto the Norwegian continental shelf. By 8,000 years ago, the entire slope was under enormous pressure. It needed only one trigger, an earthquake. Scientists believe an earthquake struck near the edge of the shelf around 6,200 BC. The sea floor shook. The slope broke loose. Enough material to bury the state of Texas under 15 feet of mud slid into the abyss. 840 cubic miles of water were instantly displaced. The wave that formed was nearly invisible in the open ocean, moving at hundreds of miles per hour, low, silent. But as it raced toward the coastlines, it slowed. And as it slowed, it reared up. On Doggerland, nobody felt the earthquake. It was too far away. It was autumn, late September or October. At a settlement on the British coast we now call Howick, the people were preparing for winter. Archaeologists later found nearly 200,000 charred hazelnut shells buried in their settlement layer, a whole community's winter food supply. That same morning, on a shoreline somewhere across the North Sea, children were probably running. The first sign wasn't the shaking, it was the sea. The water pulled back, hundreds of yards, out further than anyone had ever seen. Fish flopped on the exposed sand. Shellfish lay open to the sky. Wild cherries were ripe in the trees just inland. The children ran toward the gift. The adults followed. They had no word for tsunami. No culture had told them what a receding sea meant. In the words of Dr. Clive Waddington, the archaeologist who excavated Howick, those poor people, they really didn't know what was coming. Then they heard it, a distant roar, like thunder, but the sky was clear. The wave came not as a crest, but as a wall. It filled the horizon. It was taller than the trees. White water, 40 miles per hour over land. At the Shetland Islands, 80 feet tall. At the coast of Norway, 40 feet. In Scotland, 16 feet. Inland, it reached 26 miles. It overran hills. It surged through forests. There were 3 waves. The second was the largest. It took only minutes to do its work. By the time the water withdrew, the largest remaining piece of Doggerland had been devastated. Thousands were dead, and an entire continent had just begun its final collapse. Here is where every other version of this story ends. Here is where they say, and everyone died. But that is not what happened. The tsunami wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Doggerland survived for another 1,000 years. The wave killed thousands in its direct path. Anyone in the intertidal zone had no chance. Mortality there was 100%. The coast of northeast Britain was abandoned for the next 700 to 800 years. But the main island did not die that day. The water withdrew, plants grew back, people came back. The remaining island survived for another 1,000 years after the tsunami. Generation after generation lived on a continent that was slowly, inexorably sinking beneath them. They watched their grandparents' coastlines disappear. They watched their parents' fishing grounds disappear. They watched their children's homes go under. Around 5000 BC, over 1,000 years after the wave, the last island of Doggerland finally sank for good. A continent died in slow motion for 1,000 years. For the next 9,000 years, nobody knew it had ever existed. 9,000 years of silence under the North Sea, until Pilgrim Lockwood's shovel hit metal. Since 1931, fishermen and oil companies have been pulling up more pieces of the lost continent. A pick carved from the leg bone of an aurochs. A 13,000-year-old bone etched with a zigzag pattern by a Stone Age hand. And in recent decades, a human skull. A piece of someone who once walked Doggerland. In the 1990s, archaeologists finally gave the lost continent a name, Doggerland. For 9,000 years it had no name. Now it has one. At the bottom of the Norwegian Sea, the wave's birth scar is still there. Scientists who studied it say the slope is now stable. Another slide is only possible after a new ice age. For now, the wave that killed Doggerland sleeps. If you find these forgotten disasters fascinating, I broke down the deadliest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. 30,000 dead in under 60 seconds. Links below. Pilgrim Lockwood died in 1983. He never knew what he had discovered. His harpoon is still in a museum in Norwich in Norfolk, England, behind glass. 8.5 inches of antler, carved by a man who lived on a continent that no longer exists. The skipper who pulled it up was just trying to do his job. He had no idea he was pulling a continent back up out of the sea. The killer is rarely loud. It's almost always still arriving. 9,000 years later, the sea is still giving Doggerland back, one piece at a time. A harpoon, a skull, a bone carved by a hand nobody remembers. And somewhere beneath the North Sea, most of the continent is still waiting. Subscribe. Stay curious.